what John Kennedy just said about Jesus left Ted Cruz in tears. The studio lights blazed down on the set of Faith and Future, casting a warm glow over the two leather chairs positioned at a slight angle to one another, their rich brown upholstery gleaming under the careful attention of the production crew. A low hum of anticipation filled the air as crew members adjusted cameras, checked microphones, and whispered last-minute instructions. In one chair sat Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his trademark Southern drawl softened by the moment's gravity as he reviewed a small notepad of questions. Across from him, Senator Ted Cruz straightened his tie, his eyes scanning the studio with a mix of curiosity and resolve. The floor director called out 30 seconds, and the bustle quieted, all eyes turning to the two men who, despite their shared political affiliation, were rarely seen in such an intimate, non-partisan setting. Kennedy glanced at Cruz, offering a slight nod. "Ted, I'll be honest, when they pitched this, I wasn't sure what to make of it," he said, his voice carrying that familiar folksy cadence. Cruz chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "That makes two of us, John, but I'm glad we're here. No politics tonight, just real talk." Kennedy's lips curved into a faint smile. "Real talk it is." The floor director's fingers counted down silently, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the camera's red light blinked on, signaling they were live to millions of homes across America. "Good evening, and welcome to Faith and Future," began host Rebecca Chen, her voice steady and warm as she stood just off the set, addressing the camera. "Tonight, we bring you something extraordinary, a candid conversation between two prominent figures, Senators John Kennedy and Ted Cruz, who've agreed to set aside their public roles to discuss faith values and the future of our society. After a brief introduction, I'll step back, and they'll guide the conversation wherever it leads. Gentlemen, the floor is yours." Rebecca moved off camera, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, and the studio fell into a hushed stillness, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Cruz turned to Kennedy, his expression open and earnest. "John, I appreciate you being here. Most folks know us for our work in the Senate, but tonight's about something deeper. I've spoken often about my Christian faith, but you've been a bit more reserved on that front. Would you be comfortable sharing your thoughts on faith? What it means to you?" Kennedy shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers brushing the edge of his notepad, before he set it aside, deciding to speak from the heart. "I've always thought faith is one of those things best lived, not shouted from the rooftops. Growing up in Louisiana, church was part of the rhythm of life, Sunday services, potlucks, the whole deal, but I'll be honest, for a long time, I treated it like a habit, not a lifeline. It wasn't until I hit a rough patch, some years back, that I started asking the big questions. You know, the ones that keep you up at night. Why are we here? What's the point of all this?" Cruz nodded, his eyes fixed on Kennedy, encouraging him to continue. "I'd just come off a tough political loss." Kennedy went on, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "The kind that makes you question everything, your choices, your worth, your legacy. I was sitting in my study staring at a bottle of bourbon I didn't open, thank goodness, and I picked up a Bible that had been gathering dust on the shelf. It wasn't some grand epiphany, Ted. I just started reading, looking for something to hold on to." Cruz leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. "What did you read, John? What grabbed you?" Kennedy's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "The parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke's Gospel. Now, I'd heard that story 100 times. Growing up, preachers loved it. Sunday school teachers drilled it into us. But that night, it hit different. Here's this man beaten and left for dead, and the folks you'd expect to help the religious types they pass him by. Then comes this Samaritan, someone society looked down on, and he stops. He doesn't just toss a few coins and move on. He binds the man's wounds, puts him on his own donkey, pays for his care. That kind of compassion, Ted, it's not just kindness. It's reckless, sacrificial love. It shook me. Cruz's expression mirrored Kennedy's intensity. That's one of the most powerful stories in Scripture. What was it about that parable that spoke to you in that moment? Kennedy paused his gaze, drifting briefly to the studio lights as if gathering his thoughts. It made me realize how often I'd been like those who passed by. In my work, in my life, I'd gotten so caught up in winning debates, votes, arguments, that I'd forgotten what it means to stop and see the person in front of you. That night, I saw myself in the priest and the Levite, not the Samaritan. And I didn't like what I saw. I started asking, am I living for myself, or am I living for something bigger? The camera operator zoomed in slightly, catching the quiet conviction in Kennedy's eyes. Cruz nodded slowly. That's a hard mirror to look into, John. Most of us don't like what we see when we're honest. So, what changed for you after that? Kennedy leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. I kept reading Ted. I went through the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke. John slowly, like I was trying to solve a puzzle. I wasn't looking for a sermon or a soundbite. I wanted to understand who Jesus was, not the version folks argue about on TV, but the real man, the one who walked those dusty roads and turned the world upside down. What struck me was how he didn't just talk about love. He lived it. He ate with tax collectors, touched lepers, forgave people everyone else wrote off. That's not the kind of thing you do if you're just a teacher or a philosopher. That's someone who believes every person has worth, no matter how broken they are. Cruz's eyes widened slightly. That's not what most people expect to hear from a senator known for sharp wit and tough talk. Kennedy chuckled a low, warm sound that broke the tension in the studio. Well, Ted, I reckon I've surprised myself too. But here's the thing. I spent years thinking faith was about rules about checking boxes, go to church. Say your prayers don't cuss too much in public. But reading those Gospels, I realized it's about a relationship, about knowing Jesus, not just knowing about Him. That night in my study, I didn't just read Scripture. I prayed, really prayed, for the first time in years. Not a fancy prayer, just, Lord, I'm a mess. Show me how to do better. And I felt something shift, not like fireworks, but like a weight lifting. The crew exchanged glances, their usual restlessness replaced by rapt attention. This was no rehearsed speech. This was raw, unfiltered honesty. Cruz reached for a glass of water on the small table between them, taking a sip before responding. John, that's powerful. A lot of folks watching might relate to that feeling, like they're carrying a weight they can't shake. What did that shift look like for you? How did it change the way you move through the world? Kennedy's expression grew thoughtful, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. It made me slower to judge for one thing. In my line of work, it's easy to see people as opponents, as obstacles. But Jesus didn't do that. He saw the heart, even when it was hidden under layers of pride or pain. I started trying to do the same, not always succeeding, mind you, but trying. I remember not long after that night, I was at a town hall, and a young man stood up angry as a hornet, tearing into me over some vote I'd made. My instinct was to fire back, but instead I listened. I asked him why he felt that way, and we ended up talking for 20 minutes after the event. Turned out he was scared for his family, for his future. That conversation wouldn't have happened before. Cruz nodded. clearly moved. That's what Jesus modeled, isn't it? Meeting people where they are not where you want them to be. You mentioned the Good Samaritan earlier. Are there other teachings of Jesus that have stuck with you that you've carried into your work or your life? Kennedy's eyes lit up as if he'd been waiting for the question. Oh, plenty. The Sermon on the Mount, for one. Matthew 5-7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. That's not just poetry, Ted. It's a blueprint for a different kind of life, one that doesn't come naturally. I'll tell you, loving your enemies is about the hardest thing Jesus ever asked. I've got folks who'd rather see me run out of Washington than shake my hand, and my flesh wants to fight back. But I've been trying to pray for them, to see them as people, but not just problems. It's humbling. The camera caught Cruz wiping a subtle tear from the corner of his eye, his voice slightly unsteady as he responded. John, I don't think I've ever heard you talk like this. It's humbling for me to hear, too. That call to love our enemies, it's radical, even now, 2,000 years later. How do you manage that in a world that rewards division? Kennedy tilted his head, considering the question. Badly, some days he admitted, drawing a soft laugh from the crew. But I keep coming back to Jesus' example. He didn't just preach love, he showed it even on the cross, praying for the folks who were killing him. If he can do that, I can at least try to be kind to someone who disagrees with me. It's not about being weak, it's about being strong enough to choose compassion over contempt. That's what I'm learning anyway. Cruz leaned back, his expression a mix of admiration and reflection. That's a lesson we could all stand to learn. You know, John, one thing that's always struck me about Jesus is how he spoke with authority, not like he was guessing or hoping, but like he knew the truth. Did that stand out to you as you were reading? Kennedy nodded vigorously. Absolutely. Take John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's not a suggestion. That's a claim that demands a response. You can't just shrug and say, nice guy, good ideas. Either he's who he says he is, or he's not. I spent a lot of time wrestling with that, Ted. I looked at the historical evidence, the accounts of his life, his death, his resurrection. And I kept coming back to C.S. Lewis's point, you know, the one about Jesus being a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. The more I studied, the more I realized the first two don't hold up. That left me with the third. The studio was silent, the crew barely breathing as they hung on Kennedy's words. Cruz's eyes glistened again, his voice soft. That's a bold statement, John. Are you saying you've come to see Jesus? As Lord Kennedy held Cruz's gaze unflinching. I'm saying I've come to believe his claims deserve more than a passing glance. I'm not here to preach, Ted, but I can't read those Gospels and walk away unchanged. There's a truth there that's bigger than me, bigger than politics, bigger than any vote I'll ever cast. And it's made me want to live differently, not perfect, but better. Cruz reached for a tissue, dabbing at his eyes with a self-conscious smile. I'm sorry, John. I just didn't expect this tonight. Hearing you talk like this, it's a reminder of why faith matters, why it's worth talking about. Kennedy's expression softened, his voice gentle. No need to apologize, Ted. I didn't expect it either. But maybe that's why we're here, to remind folks that faith isn't just a private thing. It's a call to live with purpose, to love people even when it's hard to stop for the person who's hurting like that Samaritan did. That's what I'm trying to figure out, one day at a time. The camera pulled back, capturing the two men in their chairs, the studio lights framing them against the dark backdrop as the conversation paused, the weight of Kennedy's words lingering in the air. The crew exchanged looks, knowing this was no ordinary broadcast. This was a moment of raw, unexpected grace. And it was only the beginning. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the Faith and Future broadcast transitioned into its second segment, the air still charged from the raw honesty of the first. Senators John Kennedy and Ted Cruz sat in their leather chairs, the faint hum of the cameras a subtle reminder of the millions watching. The crew, usually restless during breaks, stood unusually still, captivated by the conversation unfolding. Rebecca Chen, the host, had stepped back, leaving the senators to guide the discussion. Kennedy adjusted his glasses, his expression thoughtful but relaxed, while Cruz leaned forward, his eyes bright with anticipation. The floor director signaled the cameras were rolling again, and Cruz picked up the thread, his voice warm but probing. "John, you've given us a lot to think about: your journey, the Good Samaritan, the call to live differently. I'd like to shift gears a bit. We live in a divided world politically, culturally, you name it. How do you see Jesus' teachings speaking to that division, especially in a place like Washington, where it's practically a sport?" Kennedy let out a low chuckle, his southern drawl carrying a hint of wry humor. "Ted, you're not wrong about that. Washington's like a cage match sometimes, everyone swinging for their side. But Jesus' teachings, they don't fit neatly into that ring. Take love your neighbor as yourself. Mark 12:31. Sounds simple, but in a world where your neighbor might be shouting at you on social media or voting against everything you stand for, it's a tall order. What I've been wrestling with is how to live that out when the noise is so loud you can barely think." Cruz nodded his fingers, tapping the armrest. "It's tough. We're wired to pick teams to see us versus them. How did you break through that? Especially in your work?" Kennedy leaned back, his gaze drifting to the studio ceiling for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "It starts with remembering that neighbor doesn't mean just the folks who agree with you. Jesus made that clear in the parable we talked about. The Samaritan wasn't the injured man's friend or ally. He was an outsider, someone you'd expect to keep walking. Yet, he stopped. That's been on my mind a lot, especially when I'm in the Senate, dealing with folks who see the world differently. I've tried to make a habit of listening, really, listening, not just waiting for my turn to talk. It's not easy, Ted. My instinct is to argue, to win. But I've found that when I listen first, sometimes I see the person behind the position, and that changes things." The camera zoomed in, catching the quiet conviction in Kennedy's eyes, his usual sharp wit softened by sincerity. Cruz tilted his head, clearly intrigued. "Give me an example, John. What does that look like in practice?" Kennedy's lips curved into a faint smile. "All right, I'll share one. A while back, I was working on a community project in Louisiana, trying to get funding for a job training program in a struggling parish. I reached out to a colleague from the other side of the aisle, someone I'd clashed with plenty of times. My first thought was, this'll be a fight. But instead of going in with guns blazing, I invited him to lunch. No staff, no cameras, just us. I asked about his priorities, what he was hearing from his state. Turns out, he cared about the same kind of folks I did, people who'd been left behind by the economy. We didn't agree on everything, but we found enough common ground to get that program funded. That lunch happened because I remembered Jesus' call to see the person, not just the opponent. The crew exchanged glances, impressed by the simplicity of the story and its impact. Cruz's expression softened, his voice tinged with admiration. "That's powerful, John. It's a small act, but it's the kind of thing that can ripple outward. You mentioned that project. Tell me more about it. How did it reflect your faith?" Kennedy's eyes lit up, his hands gesturing animatedly. This program was about giving folks a hand up, not a handout. We set up training for jobs in manufacturing tech things that could sustain families. I got the idea from Matthew 25, where Jesus talks about feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, caring for the least of these. I kept thinking, what's the modern equivalent? For me, it's helping people gain skills to stand on their own. The program's not perfect, but I've seen it change lives, single moms getting steady work, young men who thought they'd never have a future. That's what faith looks like to me, Ted. Not just praying for change, but rolling up your sleeves to make it happen. Cruz nodded, his fingers steepled in front of him. That's the gospel in action. But let's be real, projects like that, or even the kind of listening you're talking about, they don't always get applause. Sometimes they get pushback, especially in a culture that thrives on conflict. Have you faced that Kennedy's smile turned wry? Oh, you bet. I've had folks supporters even tell me I'm wasting time reaching across the aisle, that it's weak to compromise. And I get it. It's easier to dig in to play to the crowd. But Jesus didn't play to the crowd. He ate with sinners, talked to Samaritans, took heat from the religious elite for it. If I'm going to follow him, I can't just stick to my tribe. I've had to learn to take the criticism and keep going, knowing that the right thing isn't always the popular thing. The camera caught Cruz wiping a tear, his voice catching slightly. John, that's a courage most folks don't see in politics. It's humbling to hear. Kennedy waved a hand, deflecting the praise. Don't make me out to be a saint, Ted. I stumble plenty. But I keep coming back to Jesus' words in John 13:34. Love one another as I have loved you. That's the standard, and it's a high one. In a divided society, love doesn't mean agreeing with everyone. It means treating them with respect, even when you disagree. I've tried to carry that into debates, into committee meetings, even into the letters I get from folks who aren't exactly fans. Sometimes it's as simple as writing back, acknowledging their concerns, letting them know they're heard. Cruz leaned forward, his eyes intense. That's rare, John. Most of us, myself included, struggle to respond with grace when we're under fire. What helps you do that? Kennedy paused, his fingers brushing the edge of his glasses. Prayer, mostly. Not the fancy kind you hear in church, but the honest kind, where you lay it all out, your frustrations, your doubts, your failures. I've got a habit of praying before big votes or tough meetings, asking for wisdom to see people clearly, not just as votes or obstacles. And I pray for the folks I disagree with, which, let me tell you, is harder than it sounds. But it's hard to hate someone you're praying for. That's something Jesus understood, and it's been a game changer for me. The studio was quiet, the crew hanging on every word, their usual chatter replaced by a reverent hush. Cruz's eyes glistened again, his voice soft. That's beautiful, John. I've tried praying for my opponents, but I'll admit it's a struggle. How do you keep at it when the divide feels so wide? Kennedy's expression grew serious, his voice steady. You focus on what's eternal, not what's temporary. Politics, arguments, headlines, they come and go. But people, their worth doesn't change no matter how much they get on your nerves. Jesus saw that. In Luke 15, the parable of the lost sheep, he talks about leaving the 99 to find the one. That's how he loves relentlessly individually. If I can get even a fraction of that perspective, it helps me stay grounded. I think about that when I'm in a heated debate or reading a nasty editorial. The person on the other side isn't just a problem. They're someone Jesus loves enough to die for. That's what keeps me from writing them off. The camera operator zoomed in, capturing the intensity in Kennedy's eyes, the quiet power of his words. Cruz reached for a tissue, dabbing at his eyes with a self-conscious smile. John, I'm sorry. I keep getting choked up here. It's just your clarity on this. It's convicting. You're talking about a way of living that challenges everything our culture promotes." Kennedy shrugged, his smile gentle. "I'm just trying to follow the example, Ted." Jesus didn't shy away from hard conversations, but he always led with love. Look at how he handled the woman caught in adultery in John 8. The crowd's ready to stone her, but he doesn't join in. He challenges their hypocrisy, then offers her grace. Go and sin no more. That balance of truth and compassion, it's what I'm aiming for, even if I miss the mark half the time. Cruz nodded, his voice steadying. That's the tension, isn't it? Holding to truth without losing compassion. How do you see that playing out in our society beyond the Senate? Kennedy's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone thoughtful. We've got to start seeing each other as neighbors again, not enemies. That job training program I mentioned, it's not just about jobs. It's about reminding folks they're valued, that they're part of a community. I think Jesus' teachings point us there toward building bridges, not walls. But it takes work. It means showing up, listening, serving even when it's messy. And it means owning our mistakes. I've had to apologize more than once for words I've said in the heat of a debate. That's humbling, but it's what faith calls us to: accountability, not perfection. The camera pulled back, framing both men against the studio's dark backdrop, their connection palpable. Cruz leaned back, his expression a mix of reflection and resolve. "John, you've given us a lot to chew on. This idea of loving our neighbor, of seeing people as Jesus sees them, it's a challenge, but it's also a hope. I think folks watching tonight are going to be moved by this." Kennedy's smile returned, his voice light but sincere. "I hope so, Ted, but it's not about moving people for a night. It's about inspiring them to live differently tomorrow. That's what Jesus did. He didn't just talk about love. He showed us how. I'm just trying to follow his lead, one step at a time." The studio lights seemed to soften the air, heavy with the weight of their words, as the segment drew to a close, leaving the audience and the crew eager for what would come next. The Faith and Future studio hummed with quiet anticipation as the final segment began, the lights casting a soft glow over Senators John Kennedy and Ted Cruz, their leather chairs now feeling like familiar ground after nearly an hour of raw, heartfelt dialogue. The crew, usually bustling with last-minute adjustments, stood still, their eyes fixed on the two men whose conversation had transcended the usual political banter. The cameras rolled their red lights steady, capturing every word for the millions watching at home. Cruz, his tie slightly loosened, turned to Kennedy with a reflective smile. "John, we've covered a lot tonight, your personal journey, how faith shapes our work in a divided world. As we wrap up, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it means to live out Jesus' teachings in a way that leaves a lasting impact, not just for us, but for the people we serve. What's the legacy you're aiming for?" Kennedy leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely, his southern drawl carrying a quiet intensity. "Ted, that's the question, isn't it? Legacy's a tricky thing. Folks often think it's about buildings with your name on them or laws you passed. But Jesus' legacy wasn't marble or ink. It was lives, changed hearts, turned toward love and truth. I've been thinking a lot about his words in Matthew chapter 22:39, "Love your neighbor as yourself," and how that's not just a nice idea, but a command that demands everything. For me, living that out means doing the hard, unglamorous work of serving others even when it costs you. Especially when it costs you. The camera zoomed in, catching the resolve in Kennedy's eyes, his usual wit replaced by a depth that held the studio captive. Cruz nodded, his expression earnest. That's a high bar, John. Can you give us a story? Something that shows what that kind of costly love looks like in your life? Kennedy's lips curved into a thoughtful smile, his gaze drifting briefly as if recalling a memory. All right, I'll share one. A few years back, I was in the middle of a tough re-election campaign. One of my opponents, a fellow from the other party, was struggling. His campaign was falling apart, and the press was tearing him to shreds. Now my team was thrilled. They saw it as a clear path to victory. But I kept thinking about Jesus' words in Luke 6:27. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. This man wasn't my enemy in some grand sense, but he was working to take my job, and the world expected me to let him sink. Instead, I reached out. I called him, offered to meet for coffee. No cameras, no agenda. He was suspicious, thought it was a trap, but he showed up. Kennedy paused, his voice softening. We talked for an hour, not about politics, but about life. His kids, his worries, the toll the campaign was taking. I didn't endorse him, didn't pull punches on the issues, but I listened. Later, I quietly connected him with a few folks who could help his campaign get back on track, not to hurt my chances, but because it was the right thing to do. He didn't win, but he told me later that call kept him going when he wanted to quit. That's what Jesus meant. Ted, love that costs you something that doesn't make sense by the world's math. The crew exchanged glances, their silence a testament to the story's impact. Cruz's eyes glistened, his voice thick with emotion. John, that's extraordinary. Most folks in our position would have played the game, taken the win. What made you do it? Kennedy shrugged, his smile self-deprecating. I wish I could say it was pure virtue, but it was Jesus' example nagging at me. In John 13:15, after washing his disciples' feet, he says, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done. Washing feet isn't glamorous, and neither is helping someone who's trying to beat you. But if I'm going to claim to follow him, I've got to try. That moment wasn't about winning or losing. It was about showing that faith isn't just words, it's action, even when nobody's watching. The camera pulled back, framing both men against the studio's dark backdrop, their connection palpable. Cruz leaned back, his fingers steepled. That's a legacy worth leaving, John. But let's talk about the bigger picture. You've talked about personal acts of love, about serving your community. How do you see faith shaping society as a whole, moving us towards something better? Kennedy's expression grew serious, his voice steady. Faith at its core is about transformation, not just of individuals, but of communities, nations, the world. Jesus didn't come just to save souls. He came to show us a new way to live together. In Galatians chapter 5:22, Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. Imagine a society where those aren't just ideals but the way we operate. That's the vision I hold on to. In my work, I push for policies that lift people up: education, jobs, healthcare. Not because it's good politics, but because it's what faith demands. We're called to care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, like it says in James 1:27. That's not a suggestion, it's a mandate. Cruz nodded, clearly moved. That's a powerful vision, John, but it's not easy, especially when society pulls us towards selfishness, division. What keeps you hopeful? Kennedy's eyes softened, his voice warm. People, Ted. I've seen folks in Louisiana come together after hurricanes, sharing food, rebuilding homes, no questions asked. I've seen volunteers at that job training program I mentioned, giving up weekends to teach skills to strangers. That's the spirit at work, even in folks who might not call it that. Jesus said in Matthew 5:16, "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Every act of kindness, every sacrifice, it's a light in the darkness. That's what keeps me going." The studio was hushed. The crew visibly moved, their usual detachment replaced by awe. Cruz reached for a tissue, dabbing at his eyes with a shaky laugh. "John, you're making it hard to keep it together here, but you're right. That's the lesson, isn't it? Faith isn't just about believing. It's about doing, about shining a light." Kennedy nodded, his smile gentle. "Exactly. And here's the thing, we don't have to do it alone. Jesus promised in John 16:33, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." That's our hope, Ted. We're not building this kingdom by ourselves. We're joining what He's already started. And every time we choose love over hate, service over self, we're part of that victory. The camera zoomed in on Kennedy, his words resonating with quiet power. So here's the lesson I'd leave with folks tonight. Live your faith with courage. Love your neighbor, even when it's hard. Serve your community, even when it's messy. Forgive those who hurt you, because you've been forgiven. That's not just a personal call. It's a charge to build a world where every person is seen, valued, loved. Start small. Help a stranger. Listen to someone you disagree with. Pray for someone who's wronged you. Those acts add up, and they change more than you know. That's the legacy Jesus left, and it's the one we're all called to carry. Cruz's voice was soft, almost reverent. "John, that's a charge worth living for. Thank you for your honesty, your heart for reminding us what matters." Kennedy waved a hand, his smile warm. "Thank you, Ted, for sitting here with me. If we can leave folks with a little more hope, a little more resolve to do good, that's enough for me." The studio lights faded, the cameras pulling back. As the segment ended, the air heavy with the weight of their words. The crew stood in silence, some wiping tears, knowing they'd witnessed something rare. A call to live with purpose, to love without limits, to build a better world, one act at a time.